The first thing I heard was my own heartbeat. It pounded so violently against my ribs that, for one terrifying moment, I thought death itself had followed me into whatever came next. My lungs struggled for air as I instinctively reached for the place where I remembered the crushing pain, but instead of blood, broken bones, or the icy rocks that should have been waiting beneath me, my trembling fingers met nothing more than the soft fabric of a silk quilt. Confusion settled over me before fear ever could. I forced myself to open my eyes, only to find an embroidered canopy hanging above my bed, its familiar ivory curtains swaying gently in the morning breeze as sunlight spilt through the half-open windows. Everything about the room was achingly familiar, from the carved walnut wardrobe standing in the corner to the vase of fresh white lilies resting beside the mirror. For several long seconds, I simply stared, unable to understand how a place I had left years ago could suddenly be surrounding me again. The last thing I remembered was Victoria. I remembered her standing only a few steps away from me at the edge of the cliff, her beautiful face astonishingly calm as she watched me lose my footing. I remembered reaching toward her, not because I believed she would save me, but because some foolish part of me still refused to believe that the sister I had spent my entire life forgiving had truly decided I no longer deserved to live. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't argued, she had merely looked into my eyes with a quiet satisfaction that frightened me far more than anger ever could, before giving me the final push that sent me over the edge. As my body disappeared into the empty space below, the last thought that crossed my mind wasn't about death. It was about how I would never have the chance to return home and keep the promise I had made that morning. A slow breath escaped my lips as I pressed both hands against the mattress beneath me, forcing myself to sit upright. My pulse had begun to steady, but the uneasiness inside me only deepened. Everything about this room belonged to another lifetime. The faded wallpaper, the polished wooden floor, even the faint scent of sandalwood drifting through the air was exactly as I remembered it. This had been my bedroom in Lady Hargrove's estate, the room I had occupied before my first marriage changed the course of my life forever. That realization sent a chill through me unlike anything I had felt on the cliff. My eyes darted toward the bronze mirror across the room, and before I knew what I was doing, I had already crossed the distance between us. The young woman staring back at me couldn't possibly have been the same woman who had died only moments earlier. My features had softened with youth, untouched by years of responsibility and sleepless nights. There wasn't a trace of the quiet exhaustion that had gradually settled into my eyes during my marriage. I lifted a shaking hand toward my face, and my reflection mirrored the movement perfectly. There could be no mistake. Somehow, impossibly, I had returned to the person I had been years before everything began. A gentle knock interrupted the whirlwind of thoughts threatening to consume me. Before I could answer, one of the younger maids cautiously stepped inside, lowering her head as she reminded me that Lady Hargrove had already summoned both young ladies to the grand hall. Every distinguished family invited to today's gathering had arrived, and delaying the ceremony any longer would be considered disrespectful. Today's gathering. The words echoed through my mind with terrifying clarity. I didn't need to ask which ceremony she meant. There had only ever been one day important enough for every noble household in the capital to gather beneath the same roof. Today was the day we would choose our future husbands. The maid politely excused herself after delivering the message, leaving me standing alone before the mirror once more.
I could scarcely hear the soft click of the closing door over the pounding of my own heart. If today truly was the marriage selection ceremony, then heaven had done something I could never have imagined. It had returned me to the exact moment when every path before me was still unwritten. Every joy I had experienced, every regret I had carried, every mistake that had eventually led me to the edge of that cliff had not happened yet. For the first time since opening my eyes, I allowed myself to breathe slowly. This wasn't merely another chance to survive. It was another chance to choose. The thought should have filled me with relief, yet an uneasy feeling settled over me instead. Fate rarely offered miracles without demanding something in return, and if I had truly been given another opportunity, then I doubted I was the only one whose life had been rewritten. That strange certainty lingered in the back of my mind as I finished dressing, carefully smoothing the pale blue gown laid out for me before fastening the last pearl at my wrist. Outwardly, I looked no different from the young woman everyone expected to see. Inside, however, every step felt heavier than the one before it. The corridors of the estate hadn't changed. Servants hurried past carrying trays of refreshments, while musicians tuned their instruments somewhere beyond the main staircase. Laughter floated through the open windows, blending with the distant sound of arriving carriages. It was exactly as I remembered it, yet every familiar sight only reminded me how easily appearances could deceive. I had once believed happiness announced itself loudly, dressed in wealth, reputation, and admiration. My first life had taught me otherwise. As I reached the landing overlooking the entrance hall, footsteps echoed from the opposite corridor. I looked up instinctively, and my breath caught. Victoria. She was every bit as elegant as people remembered her to be, wearing a soft ivory gown that seemed designed to draw every eye in the room. The servants greeted her with warm smiles, and she acknowledged each of them with effortless grace. Anyone seeing her for the first time would have believed she possessed the gentlest heart in the kingdom. Then our eyes met. Neither of us moved. For the briefest moment, the carefully practiced smile on her lips disappeared completely. Surprise flashed across her face before it vanished behind the same composed expression she had worn all her life, but it had lasted long enough. Long enough for me to see it. Long enough for me to understand. There was only one reason Victoria would look at me as though she had seen a ghost. She remembered. Not fragments, not dreams. Everything. A faint smile slowly returned to her lips, calmer this time, almost triumphant, before she inclined her head with practiced elegance and continued toward the grand hall without speaking a single word. I watched her disappear around the corner, my fingers tightening almost unconsciously around the railing. The miracle I had been given no longer belonged to me alone. Victoria had returned as well.
And something deep inside me whispered that before this day came to an end, one of us would deliberately choose a different future. The question was whether fate would allow either of us to escape the consequences of the lives we had already lived. Neither of us acknowledged what had just happened. Victoria continued walking toward the grand hall with the same graceful composure she had perfected over the years, while I remained standing at the top of the staircase, watching the distance between us grow one measured step at a time. To everyone else, we were simply two daughters answering Lady Hargrove's summons. No one could have guessed that in the space of a single glance we had recognized the impossible in one another. The girl disappearing around the corner carried the same memories I did. She remembered every triumph, every humiliation, every choice that had shaped our previous lives. More importantly, she remembered the day she murdered me. I waited another minute before following after her, forcing myself to slow my breathing as I descended the staircase. Panic had never served me well. In my previous life, every lasting victory I earned came because I learned to think after everyone else had begun reacting. That lesson had saved more than one household from ruin, and if fate had truly offered me another chance, I intended to rely on it once again. Whatever Victoria planned this time, I refused to stumble blindly into it. The grand hall looked exactly as it had years before, magnificent enough to impress every visiting noble family. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors, musicians filled the room with soft melodies, and rows of distinguished guests exchanged polite smiles while pretending not to evaluate one another. Every influential family in the kingdom had gathered for the annual selection banquet, where alliances were often disguised as marriages, and affection rarely entered the conversation until much later, if it ever arrived at all. Lady Hargrove stood near the centre of the room, receiving guests with the practised elegance that had made her one of the most respected women in noble society. The warmth on her face was convincing enough to fool anyone unfamiliar with her. I had spent enough years beneath her roof to know the difference between courtesy and kindness. One was effortless for her, the other had never been. Her eyes settled on Victoria first, lingering with unmistakable pride before shifting toward me. The smile she offered me was pleasant enough, but it carried the same careful distance I remembered from my childhood. Nothing had changed there. Whether it was my first life or my second, I was still the daughter she tolerated rather than cherished. As I approached, she merely reminded us that every family invited today had raised extraordinary sons and that our decisions would shape the future of our lives. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who believed destiny favored careful planning. If only she knew destiny had already been rewritten before breakfast. I lowered my gaze respectfully, concealing the irony threatening to reach my expression. The previous time I stood in this hall, I believed the most valuable husband was the one everyone admired. Wealth, influence, reputation, noble lineage, I had once thought those qualities were enough to measure a man. Life had taught me how little appearances revealed. Across the hall stood Alexander Ashford. He drew attention without making the slightest effort. His family controlled one of the kingdom's oldest noble houses. His reputation was spotless, and countless young ladies stole glances in his direction while pretending not to. Every conversation surrounding him echoed the same certainty. Whoever married Alexander Ashford would enjoy a lifetime of admiration. I knew better. Not because Alexander lacked character, but because perfection had always been an illusion. Even in my previous life, beneath his impeccable manners, lived a man burdened by expectations, vulnerable to manipulation from those he trusted most. His greatest weakness had never been ambition. It had been his willingness to believe the wrong people simply because they spoke with confidence. The first time fate joined our lives, I discovered those cracks only after we were married. By then, the damage had already begun. Quietly, patiently, I spent years helping him untangle the web surrounding his household. Together, we uncovered financial deception, exposed advisors who profited from his blind trust, and dismantled alliances that would eventually have destroyed both his inheritance and his name. None of it happened overnight. None of it happened because Alexander suddenly became extraordinary. It happened because we faced every storm together until he finally learned to trust his own judgment. That was the man Victoria remembered envying. She had never envied the difficult years. She had envied the peaceful ending. A faint movement near the entrance drew my attention. Julian Kingsley had just arrived. Unlike Alexander, Julian entered the hall without attracting admiration. His clothing was elegant but understated, his expression calm, almost unreadable, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who neither sought attention nor avoided it. Most of the guests barely spared him a second glance before returning their attention to the more celebrated families. I couldn't help smiling to myself. Some fortunes announced themselves loudly, others never needed introductions. Very few people in this room knew who Julian Kingsley truly was. Fewer still understood the influence his family quietly held beyond the kingdom's borders. They saw a gentleman of respectable birth. I knew the man standing there possessed enough wealth to purchase half the estates represented in this hall without disturbing his morning schedule. His greatest strength, however, had never been his fortune. It was the remarkable peace with which he carried it. Power had never made him arrogant. Success had never made him cruel. Even now, before our paths had crossed in this life, I remembered countless moments from years that no longer existed, moments when his generosity had quietly changed the lives of people who would never know his name. For reasons I still didn't fully understand, Julian had chosen to keep that side of himself hidden from society. Perhaps that secrecy had protected him. Perhaps it had isolated him. Either way, it explained why Victoria had overlooked him the first time. Her eyes had always searched for the brightest jewel in the room. Mine had learned to search for the steadiest heart. Just then, I felt someone watching me. I turned. Victoria stood only a short distance away. She wasn't looking at Alexander. She was looking at Julian. There it was. Confirmation. The smallest smile curved her lips before she looked away again, but it was enough. She had come here believing she already knew which choice would secure the happiest future. She believed she was about to steal the life she thought had belonged to me. I almost pitied her, because the greatest misunderstanding of Victoria's life had never been choosing the wrong husband. It had always been believing that another woman's happiness could be stolen simply by standing in her place. Two brides, two different beginnings. The selection ceremony unfolded beneath a storm of polite applause, but all I could hear was the sound of my own pulse. When Lady Hargrove invited us to make our choices, Victoria rose first with the confidence of someone who believed she had already seen the future. She crossed the hall without hesitation and stopped before Alexander Ashford, her smile radiant enough to draw approving murmurs from every corner of the room. The reaction was immediate. Several noblewomen exchanged satisfied glances, and even Lady Hargrove's expression softened with unmistakable pride. To everyone watching, Victoria had secured the most desirable match in the kingdom. Alexander inclined his head gracefully, though I noticed a flicker of surprise in his eyes before he accepted her choice. It was gone almost instantly, hidden beneath the polished composure that had made society admire him for years. Victoria didn't notice. She was too busy basking in the admiration surrounding her. Then the hall grew quiet, as all attention turned toward me. In my previous life, I had walked toward Alexander believing I was accepting a difficult future. This time, I let my gaze drift past the cluster of nobles surrounding him until it settled on Julian Kingsley, who stood near one of the tall windows as though he would have been perfectly content if no one had called his name at all. For a heartbeat, his eyes met mine. There was no arrogance in them, no calculation, only a calm curiosity that made the noise of the hall seem strangely distant. I chose him. The silence that followed lasted only a moment, but it felt much longer. I could almost hear the room recalculating my worth. A few guests looked confused, others looked sympathetic. One elderly countess actually sighed as though I had thrown away my future. Julian, however, simply stepped forward and bowed with quiet respect, thanking me for the honor with a sincerity that caught me off guard. When I glanced toward Victoria, I found her watching me with poorly concealed triumph. She believed she had won. More importantly, she believed I knew it too. The celebrations continued long after the formal announcements ended, but the atmosphere around us had changed. Victoria was surrounded by admirers offering congratulations on her brilliant choice, while I received the kind of gentle encouragement people reserved for someone they thought would eventually regret her decision. I accepted every comment with a calm smile, though inside I couldn't help wondering how differently these same people would speak, once they learned who Julian Kingsley truly was. As the evening drew to a close, Lady Hargrove summoned us to her private sitting room. The moment the door closed behind us, she turned to Victoria first, praising her wisdom and remarking that an alliance with the Ashford family would elevate our household standing considerably. Victoria accepted the praise with lowered lashes and a modest smile that would have been convincing if I hadn't known her all my life. When Lady Hargrove finally looked at me, her expression became gentler but noticeably more restrained. She told me that Julian appeared respectable, and a peaceful marriage was often better than a dazzling one. The words were kindly spoken, yet they carried the unmistakable implication that she considered my choice a consolation prize. I accepted her anyway. After we were dismissed, Victoria lingered in the corridor long enough to stop me. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she studied my face with the careful attention of someone searching for disappointment. When she finally spoke, she remarked that she had expected me to fight harder for Alexander. I answered that some battles were not worth fighting. Her smile widened at that, and she replied that perhaps I was wiser than she had given me credit for, before sweeping away toward her chambers. I watched her go, feeling an expected ache in my chest. In another life, I would have warned her. I would have tried to make her understand that Alexander's future was not as effortless as it appeared. But standing there in the quiet corridor, I realized that no warning I offered would change anything. Victoria had already decided what happiness looked like. She had mistaken admiration for security and reputation for destiny.
That night, I found a small wooden box waiting on the table in my room. There was no elaborate seal, no display of wealth, only a neatly folded note bearing Julian's name. Inside rested a single silver hairpin shaped like a crescent moon. It was elegant without being ostentatious, and beneath it lay a brief message expressing his hope that our future would be built on honesty rather than appearances. I stared at those words for a long time. In my previous life, Alexander's first gift had been a necklace worth more than most families earned in a year. The kingdom had admired its brilliance, yet somehow this simple hairpin, chosen with obvious care, felt infinitely more personal. The next morning brought another surprise. While the estate buzzed with preparations for our upcoming engagements, a visitor arrived requesting a private audience with me. I expected one of Lady Hargrove's acquaintances. Instead, I found Julian waiting in the garden. He rose the moment I approached and apologized for calling so early, explaining that he would soon be leaving the capital for several days to settle urgent business matters. What caught my attention wasn't the explanation itself, but the way several senior servants, who normally ignored lesser nobles, treated him with unusual deference. One of them even bowed more deeply to him than he had ever bowed to Lady Hargrove. Julian seemed not to notice. As we walked along the garden path, he asked whether I was unhappy with yesterday's choice. The question was so direct that I almost laughed. I told him the truth, that my decision had been made very carefully. For the first time since we met, something warm appeared in his expression, though it vanished almost as quickly as it came. Before leaving, he paused beside the gate and said he hoped I would judge him by what I did not yet know, rather than what the world assumed about him. The words lingered with me long after he disappeared from sight. By evening, rumours about Victoria's engagement to Alexander had already spread across the capital. Everyone called it a perfect match. Everyone congratulated Lady Hargrove on her good fortune. No one paid much attention to my quiet betrothal to Julian Kingsley. As I stood by the window watching the sunset bleed across the rooftops, I found myself wondering how long that indifference would last once the truth began to emerge. Because, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I wasn't walking toward a future I feared. I was walking toward a future I had chosen with my eyes open.
The future cannot be stolen. The days that followed Julian's departure slipped by more quickly than I expected. Looking back now, I remember them less for the endless fittings in wedding preparations than for the strange calm that had settled over my heart. In my previous life, every step toward my wedding had been accompanied by uncertainty. I had been walking toward a future I hoped I could repair. This time was different. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I wasn't trying to change a man's destiny. I was simply preparing to begin my own. Lady Hargrove threw herself into the preparations with remarkable enthusiasm, though most of her attention naturally revolved around Victoria's marriage to Alexander Ashford. Every noblewoman who visited the estate spoke of what a magnificent alliance it was, praising Victoria's foresight and Lady Hargrave's guidance in equal measure. Whenever the conversation turned to my own upcoming marriage, the compliments became noticeably gentler. People described Julian as respectable, quiet and dependable, the sort of man who would provide a peaceful household, if not an exceptionally remarkable one. I accepted every well-meaning remark with a smile. If there was one lesson my previous life had taught me, it was that the world had an unfortunate habit of confusing reputation with truth. Julian returned to the capital the evening before the ceremony, exactly as he had promised. Our meeting before the wedding was brief, but I remember thinking how easily conversations seemed to come whenever we stood together. He apologized once more for being absent during so much of the preparation, explaining that business had delayed him longer than expected. I simply told him that a marriage would be measured by the years that followed, rather than the days leading up to it. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, before quietly saying he hoped to spend many peaceful years proving that I had chosen wisely. Those words stayed with me long after we parted. Our wedding ceremony took place the following morning beneath clear skies that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Victoria and Alexander stood before the altar first, every bit the picture of the kingdom's ideal noble couple. Their vows were met with enthusiastic applause, and more than one guest whispered that no union that season could possibly surpass theirs. Then it was our turn. As I walked toward Julian, I found myself strangely untouched by the comparisons surrounding us. In another life, I might have worried about appearances, or wondered whether I had chosen the more difficult road. Instead, I felt only an unexpected sense of certainty. Julian greeted me with the same quiet respect he had shown from the very beginning, and when we exchanged our vows, I realized I wasn't trying to recreate the happiness I once knew. I was building something entirely new.
The celebrations lasted well into the afternoon before the 2 newly married couples finally departed in separate carriages. I remember glancing back through the window one last time as Lady Hargrove's estate disappeared behind us. Victoria stood surrounded by admirers, smiling as though the entire world had finally acknowledged what she believed she deserved. At the time, I simply wished that smile would remain genuine. The journey to the Kingsley estate took longer than I expected. As we travelled farther from the capital, I found myself wondering whether I truly knew the man sitting beside me. We had spoken only a handful of times before our marriage, yet the silence between us never felt uncomfortable. Julian seemed perfectly content to allow me the space to take in my new surroundings at my own pace, occasionally pointing out familiar landmarks or asking whether I was comfortable during the journey. It was such a simple kindness, yet I realized I had rarely experienced it before. When our carriage finally passed through the estate gates, I instinctively leaned toward the window. The residence before us was nothing like the modest country manor I had imagined. The estate stretched across rolling hills bordered by ancient oak trees, its stone buildings elegant without being ostentatious. Uniformed guards stood at every entrance, and before the carriage had even come to a complete stop, senior stewards had already gathered to welcome Julian home.
What surprised me wasn't their efficiency, but the unmistakable respect with which they greeted him. It wasn't the rehearsed politeness servants often showed noblemen, it was genuine loyalty. As Julian stepped down first and offered me his hand, every member of the household bowed. Not to me, to him. Over the following days, those quiet surprises continued to multiply. Visitors arrived almost every afternoon. Some were wealthy merchants whose names I recognized immediately. Others were respected magistrates, military commanders, and influential nobles whose presence would have honored almost any household in the kingdom. They all requested meetings with Julian, and every one of them treated him with a level of respect that didn't match the modest reputation society had given him. No one spoke of it directly. No one explained anything. But little by little, I began realizing that the man the capital dismissed as merely respectable occupied a position far more significant than anyone had allowed me to believe. The realization didn't arrive through some dramatic revelation. It arrived quietly, piece by piece, until denying it became impossible. What surprised me even more was Julian himself. Despite everything I was beginning to notice, nothing about him changed. He remained the same thoughtful man who asked whether I had slept well, who insisted we share breakfast together whenever his schedule allowed, who thanked servants by name instead of speaking to them as though they were invisible, and who listened when I offered an opinion instead of merely waiting for his turn to speak. It wasn't his influence that impressed me. It was the fact that he carried it so lightly. Several weeks later, while writing a letter to Lady Hargrove, I found myself smiling without realizing it. Only then did it occur to me that I hadn't spent a single day wishing I had made a different choice. At the time, I still believed that quiet contentment was the greatest blessing this marriage would offer me. I had no idea that the rest of the kingdom was only beginning to discover the truth about the man I now called my husband. The first few weeks of my marriage passed with a quietness I had never imagined could exist between two people who had once been strangers. Looking back now, I think that was the first lesson Julian unknowingly taught me. Happiness did not always arrive with grand declarations or breathtaking gestures. Sometimes it revealed itself in the smallest moments, so gently that you almost failed to notice them until they became part of your everyday life. Every morning we shared breakfast before the demands of the day carried him elsewhere. No matter how busy his schedule became, he always made time to ask how I had slept, or whether there was anything I wished to change within the estate. At first, I answered cautiously, still uncertain whether he asked out of courtesy or genuine interest. It didn't take long for me to realize he never dismissed my opinions. If I suggested an improvement, he considered it seriously. If I disagreed with him, he listened instead of becoming offended. I had spent one lifetime believing respect had to be earned through sacrifice. Julian showed me that true respect was given freely to the person one chose to love. The household itself slowly became familiar. I learnt the names of every servant, every steward, and every guard stationed around the estate. In return, they welcomed me with a warmth that felt entirely genuine. It surprised me how fiercely loyal they were to Julian. Whenever they spoke of him, there was admiration in their voices, but never fear. That alone told me more about the kind of man he was than any title ever could. As the weeks passed, I began accompanying him whenever guests visited the estate. It was then that I started seeing pieces of the truth that society had somehow overlooked. One afternoon, a delegation from the Royal Council arrived without prior notice. I had expected them to request an audience several days in advance, yet the moment they entered the estate, every member greeted Julian with the respect usually reserved for members of the royal household. Throughout the meeting, men whose names carried influence across the kingdom listened carefully whenever he spoke. More than once, I noticed them altering their own recommendations after hearing his opinion. When the guests finally departed, curiosity overcame me. I asked him whether those meetings were a regular occurrence. He smiled in that quiet way of his, before admitting that they happened often enough. He explained that his family had spent generations advising the crown, though they had always preferred influence exercised quietly rather than publicly. Reputation, he told me, had a habit of attracting unnecessary enemies. Results mattered much more than recognition. That simple explanation somehow suited him perfectly. He had never hidden who he was, he simply had never felt the need to announce it. As the months passed, I began noticing another change, though this one had nothing to do with my marriage. The visitors arriving from the capital carried different conversations than before. At first, they merely remarked that Lord Julian Kingsley seemed to hold considerably more influence than society had previously assumed. Then came whispers about wealthy merchant houses seeking his advice before making important investments. Soon afterward, I overheard noble families discussing how often members of the royal council visited the Kingsley estate compared to other prominent households. Little by little, the image the capital had built around my husband began changing. No dramatic announcement ever came. People simply started realizing what had always been true. It was during one of Lady Hargrove's visits that I first sensed something else had changed. She spent much of the afternoon admiring the estate before quietly admitting she hadn't expected the Kingsley family to possess such extensive lands or such close ties to the crown. There was no bitterness in her voice, only genuine surprise. Before leaving, she squeezed my hand and remarked that perhaps she had judged too quickly. I remember smiling without saying very much. Some truths were more satisfying when people discovered them on their own. Not every visitor brought pleasant news, however. It was through Lady Hargrove that I first heard whispers that Victoria wasn't adjusting to married life as effortlessly as everyone had expected. She didn't tell me much, only that Alexander had become increasingly occupied with political affairs and spent long stretches away from home, attending council meetings and private consultations. Lady Hargrove dismissed it as the natural burden of an influential nobleman, but something about her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. I didn't press for details. Whatever happened inside my sister's marriage no longer belonged to me. Still, over the months that followed, similar comments reached me from different directions. One guest casually mentioned that Lord Ashford's household seemed unusually tense. Another remarked that several long-time advisers had become almost inseparable from him. A merchant who frequently travelled between noble estates observed that Lady Victoria appeared less radiant than she had immediately after her wedding. None of those remarks meant very much on their own. Together, however, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. I often found myself wondering whether history was quietly repeating itself. Then I would remind myself that it was no longer my responsibility to prevent it. In my previous life, I had spent years helping Alexander distinguish honest counsel from dangerous ambition. I had stood beside him through political storms, encouraged patience when others demanded haste, and persuaded him more than I could count to trust his own judgment instead of chasing the approval of those around him. This life was different. Those conversations had never happened. Those lessons had never been learned. Whenever that realization crossed my mind, I felt neither satisfaction nor regret, only acceptance. One evening, as Julian and I walked through the estate gardens after supper, he noticed my unusually thoughtful silence and asked whether something was troubling me. I remember telling him that I had simply been thinking about how strange life could be, how people often spent years chasing what glittered in the distance while overlooking the quiet blessings already placed before them. He looked at me for a long moment before gently taking my hand. Then, with that same calm sincerity that had first drawn me toward him, he said he believed the greatest fortunes were rarely the loudest ones. I smiled because I realized, perhaps for the first time, that I loved him, not because of his influence, not because of his wealth, not because the rest of the kingdom was finally beginning to recognize the remarkable man he had always been. I loved him because every ordinary day beside him felt like the kind of peace I had once believed existed only in dreams. I didn't know then that peace has a way of attracting envy, and somewhere beyond the walls of the Kingsley estate, the life Victoria had so confidently chosen was beginning to unravel in ways that would soon find their way back to my door. She stole my choice, not my destiny. Looking back now, I often think the beginning of the end arrived so quietly that none of us recognized it for what it was. Months had passed since my marriage to Julian, and life within the Kingsley estate had settled into a peaceful rhythm I had once believed impossible. The capital no longer spoke of my husband as though he were merely a respectable noble with a quiet disposition. His influence had revealed itself naturally, not because he sought recognition, but because the kingdom had finally begun noticing how often the crown sought his counsel before making its most important decisions. People who had once pitied my choice now praised my wisdom. It was uncomfortable change. I had not married Julian to prove anyone wrong. I had simply chosen the man who gave me peace. The first sign that something was changing beyond our gates arrived in the form of an unexpected visitor, Alexander Ashford. When the steward informed me that Lord Ashford had requested a private audience, I assumed it concerned some official matter involving Julian. Instead, when I stepped into the drawing room, I found Alexander standing alone by the window, looking older than I remembered. It wasn't the passing of time that had changed him, it was the heaviness in his eyes. The moment he saw me, he bowed with the same courtesy he had always possessed, before quietly apologizing for appearing without notice. He admitted that what he had come to discuss would sound unbelievable, yet he could no longer carry it alone. I invited him to speak. After a long silence, he confessed that for several nights he had been haunted by dreams so vivid they no longer felt like dreams at all. In them, he said, we had been husband and wife. At first he dismissed the visions as imagination, but they refused to disappear. Night after night, he watched fragments of another life unfold before him. He remembered making mistakes. He remembered allowing ambitious advisers to cloud his judgment. Most painfully of all, he remembered someone standing beside him through every failure, patiently helping him become the man history later admired. When he finally looked at me again, his voice had become almost unrecognizable. He asked whether he believed it was possible that memories could survive a lifetime. For a long moment, I simply looked at him. There had been a time when I had imagined I would have given anything to hear those words. That time had passed. I answered as honestly as I could, telling him that life often left us with questions no one could explain. Whether his dreams came from memory or regret was something only heaven could truly answer. What mattered now was the life standing before him, not the one that might have been. He lowered his eyes. Then he quietly admitted that the woman from those dreams had changed him.
Without her, every decision seemed to unravel into another mistake. He said he finally understood that the strength people had once admired in him had never belonged to him alone. It had been built beside someone who believed in him when he could not believe in himself. I felt an ache for the man he might have become, but not for the life we had lost. I told him that if those dreams were real, then I was grateful they had belonged to another lifetime. In this life, I had found the home I was meant to have, and I hoped, sincerely, that he would one day find peace in his own. He closed his eyes for a brief moment before offering a sad smile. Then he thanked me. It was the last private conversation we ever shared.
I didn't think much about that meeting afterward. It was only several days later that I learned it had not remained private. Victoria arrived at Kingsley Estate without warning. The moment she entered the drawing room, I knew she hadn't come seeking reconciliation. Her face carried the bitterness of someone who had spent too long blaming everyone except herself. She accused me of ruining her marriage. At first, I couldn't understand what she meant. Then, with trembling anger, she revealed that Alexander had confessed to her that those dreams, if they were true, had belonged to the happiest years of his life to the woman he had lost, not the wife standing beside him now. Victoria said he had looked at her with disappointment she had never seen before, and for the first time since their wedding, she realized she could never become the woman he wished he had married. She pointed at me with tears burning in her eyes and declared that I had stolen her husband without ever marrying him. I remember looking at her in silence. When I finally spoke, my voice was far calmer than I expected. I told her that she had never lost Alexander to me. She had lost him to her own choices. In our previous life, I had not been handed a perfect husband. I had stood beside a flawed man, challenged him when he was wrong, encouraged him when he doubted himself, and remained patient when walking away would have been easier. The man Victoria envied had not existed at the beginning of that life. He had become that man, and people only become better when they are willing to grow. Victoria shook her head, refusing to hear me. She insisted destiny had cheated her. I answered gently that destiny had given us both exactly the same opportunity. The only difference was what each of us chose to build. Not long afterward, news spread through the capital that Alexander had formally dissolved their marriage. Many blamed the political scandals surrounding his household. Others whispered about irreconcilable differences. People invented countless explanations, but I never cared enough to discover which one society preferred. By then, I had already learned that public opinion changed as easily as the wind. Months later, Lady Hargrove visited the Kingsley estate once more. Age seemed to have softened her pride. Before leaving, she apologized, not only for underestimating Julian, but for spending so many years measuring people's worth by titles, appearances, and reputation instead of character. I accepted her apology without resentment. Some lessons simply required a lifetime to learn. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the hills surrounding the estate, Julian found me standing in the gardens where we often walked together. Without saying a word, he slipped his hand into mine. After everything we had endured, neither of us needed grand speeches anymore. Peace itself had become our language. As we watched the last light fade from the sky, I realized something that had taken 2 lifetimes to understand. Victoria believed she could steal my future by taking the man I had once married. She never understood that my happiness had never belonged to a single person. It had always been shaped by the choices I made, the love I chose to give, and the life I chose to build. She stole my choice, but she never could have stolen my destiny.